And I'm going to talk mainly about no-take marine reserves because these are the ones that always work, right? When you don't kill fish, as Andy said the other day, when you don't kill fishes, they take a longer time to die, and they grow older, and they reproduce more, even though some fishery scientists still have a problem believing that. So the question I'm going to ask you also, because there were people from the finance ministry and the ministry for energy, and who's going to pay for this? This is too expensive, we cannot afford it. I'm going to answer this question. And the answer I'm going to tell you already is yes. Israel can afford a system of marine reserves. Again, a reminder, a marine reserve where fishing is prohibited not only preserves what's there, but restores what was there before. This is bottom with bedrock and sea urchins, and you can turn this with real protection into this, a place with lots of algae, lots of fish. On average, the biomass of fish inside marine reserves increases 500% in less than 10 years. Find me a stock at Wall Street that will deliver that performance. The size of fish increases on average 30% in the Mediterranean and all around the world. So the ecological benefits inside the boundaries of these reserves are very clear. But then also we have these amazing economic benefits, like at the Medas Islands in Spain. Again, it's an amazing example. Less than 1 square kilometer resulted in 200 new jobs and 10 million euros in revenue every year. It's bringing 20 times more money than fishing. And the fishermen there, that's for Andy too, there are 2 happy fishermen in the world. The second one is from the Medas Islands. There is this guy who you will see on the film tonight. He feels better, that's good. You will see in the film tonight, if you come, there is one fisherman from the Medas Islands who's very happy, who says that without the reserve, I couldn't be fishing. And now, look, I'm doing much better off than people elsewhere. In other places, in developing countries, in Kenya, the Solomon Islands, in the Solomon Islands there is a village where a reserve was created with an investment of $10,000 over 2 years. After 5 years, the reserve had so many fish inside, they spilled over, and they benefited the local fishing. And you have then the secondary benefits along the chain, the economic chain. In 5 years, the income of 600 people doubled. It was multiplied times 2, thanks to the reserve. Another example of great benefit for fishermen, again, is the Columbretes Islands Marine Reserve in Spain, where every year there are so many lobsters inside this reserve, and they reproduce so much that every year 7% of the lobsters migrate outside of the reserve, and because they are larger than the lobsters outside, it means that every year the fishermen are catching 10% more lobsters every single year. So they benefit from these reserves. So think of the Mediterranean coast of Israel as a bank account, a checking account, where everybody withdraws, everybody takes money out, but nobody makes a deposit. At one point, what's going to happen with the bank account? There's going to be no money left. These marine reserves are like savings accounts, where we have a principal that we set aside that produces interest. And when it comes to thinking about the size of the reserves, you think that these 6 areas that Ruthie showed on the map are big. They are very small, very small. If you're thinking of doing marine protected areas multi-use, that it will include a very small no-take area, you will probably be disappointed. Because if you have money and you put it on a savings account, you want to put as much money as you want in the account. The more money you put, the more returns you're going to get. That's investing 101. Same thing for the reserves. So I think that yes, you are being very, very timid when it comes to planning for the size of the no-take areas here, based on the experience that we've seen worldwide. So this is a map of the current marine protected areas of Israel in light blue. Not only the projector is not very powerful, but also it's very difficult to see them. It's only 9 square kilometers. And it's smaller than the city of Tel Aviv. And it's only a fraction of 1% of Israel's waters. And this is the plan you guys are working on. These 6 reserves that would occupy 20% of the territorial waters of Israel, or around 800 square kilometers. Now, how much is this going to cost, right? And now let's get into the, we've seen the generalities before. Let's talk about the real numbers, real business. How much this is going to cost to Israel? Based on our knowledge on how much does it cost to establish marine reserves, and how much does it cost to operate them every year, with gasoline, boats, personnel, education, monitoring, everything. So last night I calculated how much it would cost to create and manage these 6 reserves based on an average for 80 reserves around the world for which we have detailed information. And it would cost 14 million shekels to create these reserves, develop the infrastructure, buying the boats, hiring the personnel, etc. And the annual cost for the operation would be less than 7 million shekels. Okay, this is how much it would cost. Now, who's going to pay for this? And of course, the Minister of Finance does not want to hear about this, right? And everybody's asking for money all the time. Well, let's go to examples around the world. The Saba Marine Reserve in the Caribbean pays for itself just from taxes that come from tourism. 87% of the revenue of this reserve, which is $3 million, very small place, comes from diving. People who go there because there are fish that they cannot see elsewhere in the Caribbean. The Medas Islands, my favorite example. The value of tourism is 20 times also than the value, that the cost of management of the reserve. And the fees paid by the divers and other people to go and have the opportunity, the privilege to see these amazing groupers. In one dive, you can see 30 groupers like this. The fees raised by the tourism alone pay for the management cost for the entire reserve for the entire year. So the reserves can pay for themselves. Another example, and this is the largest we have in terms of economics, is the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, which is an MPA with multiple use, but a third of the Great Barrier Reef is no-take areas, really, really large areas, when you compare it to other parts around the world. The Great Barrier Reef resulted in 54,000 jobs and $5.5 billion Australian dollars per year. And the value of tourism is 36 times the value of fishing. And the fishermen are catching more also around the reserves. So in Israel, who would finance this? Who would pay for this? And I just made these numbers based on the experience from these other reserves. Maybe it's not 7. You need to buy a good projector for this room. Maybe it's not 7 million shekels. Maybe it's 10 or 15. It doesn't matter. It's going to be around that, that order of magnitude. But just imagine, very simple. Every year, the government of Israel spends 1 million shekel, at least 1 million shekel, in subsidies that are harmful, the perverse subsidies to fuel and others that perpetuate overfishing. Redirecting these subsidies that hurt fishing into marine reserves would bring some money. Let's assume that in these 6 reserves, in a few years, when you have all the fish, you would have a total of 50,000 dives. In the Medas Islands, only in that 1 square kilometer, there are 60,000 dives per year. And people pay $5, 3.5 euros per dive. And people pay it very happily. And people are willing to pay more based on economic analysis. 1 square kilometer, 60,000 divers. If you had fish here, we could assume that you could have 50,000 divers, in 6 reserves covering 800 square kilometers, right? If everybody paid $5, you would have 1 more million shekels in diving fees. Now, there are 100,000 sport fishermen or more, as Alon told us the other day. In other countries, people pay for their licenses, for the privilege to fish, right? Let's assume that every license, the annual license, were $50, which is the price of a dinner here at the port of Tel Aviv, with a couple of beers. if every sport fisherman in Israel who has a license had to pay $50 a year to get that license, you'd raise almost 20 million shekels. So just with these three sources of revenue that came up on our discussion yesterday on the boat without thinking seriously about it, without having any economist involved, right? You could be raising enough money to manage to cover the costs of the reserves, plus enough money to finance the transition from a system where there is open access, where everybody can fish everywhere, to a system where you have good regulations with a core of large no-take areas. And that financing the transition means financing the short-term loss for the fishermen who are fishing in these areas, who can prove that they are fishing in these areas, and who can prove that they are going to incur in a short-term economic loss because of the creation of the reserves.